Okay, so this is the audio review for Chapter 9, Field Research and In-Depth Interviews. So in this chapter, we're going to go over the general features of qualitative research, variations in qualitative research, the process of planning and conducting field research, and the process of planning and conducting in-depth interviews, go through some of the differences, and then the strengths and weaknesses themselves. Okay. So, as usual, the chapter starts out with a study. And so the study the chapter uses is just an example, ultimately, about globalization, to try to illustrate how qualitative research works, right? So, globalization itself is just the cultural, political, and economic connectedness of nations and people. So one major part of globalization is migration or immigration. So how do immigrants adapt to a new society? There's different ways, right? There's assimilation, which is when migrants adopt the cultural understandings of the host country. Well, another response is transnationalization, which is the process where migrants or immigrants and their children still remain linked to their home country through different observed rituals or regular rituals and practices. So researchers wanted to look at these factors by focusing on studying transnationalization among Taiwanese immigrants to New York, and really looking at how does continuing contact with the nation of origin affect their assimilation. So they did this by approaching it through field research in both Mexico and New York City. And this was carried out between 1991 and 2005, as a lot of these research studies take a long time, right? Because you're really trying to get at all the meanings and understandings of this group of people. So this involved observations and interviews. And what Smith found was that living in New York was not easy for any of the Mexican participants, as they faced discrimination. They were forced to compete for limited work opportunities with other racial minorities and immigrants. Opportunities such as, again, work opportunities, jobs, but also education, housing, other stuff. So this had consequences for their kids, as their kids tended to get their first job in the industry their parents worked in, which are typically industries of hard labor, low pay, low status jobs. As all of us, second generation migrants, their life chances depended on their education. So many of the respondents that they talked to in the research that Smith talked to did not finish high school. So as a result, some of them got involved in drugs and gangs, and in order to really find power and status and money in ways that aren't socially accepted, due to, largely to the lack of legitimate opportunities that they weren't able to get. So, basically what was interesting is the Taiwanese people that were more connected to Mexico were largely had a relationship of connectedness or solidarity because of this committee in New York that, really kept people grounded or connected to their cultural identity. So they looked at how many immigrants remained connected, basically through these kind of cultural understandings to, where they came from. And what's interesting was that they talked about really how this resulted in a lot of cultural conflicts. So gender conflicts was a big one, that there's conflicts between the gender expectations in Mexico and those in New York. So they found that migration to the U.S. is a challenge to what they call ranchero masculinity, this ideology that justifies women's subordination to men. So while migrant women that were first generation were more likely to accept that, for second generation migrants, they were much more likely to embrace the cultural values of the U.S. than their parents were, particularly those in regard to gender expectations, which can obviously cause conflict or make those second generation people feel like they have a lack of belonging to the migrant group. And this is a problem, as some are seeking out gangs to fill that void. So really, the common theme is the search for recognition and respect that they found through the research. So it's more than assimilation. It's an attempt to succeed and simultaneously hold on to their culture of origin, which Smith argues can lead to what he calls negative assimilation, meaning people are becoming more poor, less stable, more vulnerable to gangs and gang violence. So again, the kind of reason why people are doing these kind of in-depth studies is to find out what the meanings and understandings are of their participants so that they can then understand their social world and their social reality. The other research study that they talked about in the chapter is another approach to looking at a similar topic, but this is how Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants experience assimilation. So the researcher, she said that this is important to study, especially in light of the U.S. backlash against immigration, where we tend to pretend as if only people from Mexico are migrating to this country, though there's this thing called planes. Turns out planes deliver all sorts of people. It's not just people coming through the border. So anyway, they really want to do a study of, how Mexican American families or how different generations of their families develop a sense of racial identity. So to do this, her methodological approach was to conduct in-depth interviews with members of 29 three-generation families. And so the interviewees were predominantly middle class. They had higher than average incomes. And they were more college educated or, had more white collar occupations than the norm. And so what she found was that identity varied by family and generation. So how connected someone felt to their Mexican identity or heritage varies. Some families were characterized by what she called finned attachment. This is where racial and ethnic identity declines over time. Usually this is not, usually this is included in not teaching your children to speak Spanish, or not seeing the language as an important thing to be passed on generationally, versus other people were characterized by what she called cultural maintenance. So this is where they maintain the Spanish language and other cultural practices. Like one of the respondents told the story of facing discrimination, which made him more connected to his heritage and facilitated his involvement in the Chicano movement, and later his bilingual skills are a benefit in his job as a county sheriff, right? So how people understood their identity varied. And she could basically group the people together into these two groups, either thin detachment or cultural maintenance. And she found certain levels of this depending on if you're first generation, second generation, or third generation. So again, another example of research, how it can be conducted to look at a similar research interest, but in this case, doing in-depth interviews instead of a more ethnographic approach. So boiling it down, there's some general features of qualitative research. The first is observation. So this is direct and takes place in a natural setting. This is the primary method of data collection within field research, right? And this is how you record it in extensive field notes that you take while you're in a setting, kind of compiling all the things that you find relevant information. And it's also usually accompanied by a researcher's direct experience. Often you'll have some sort of insider knowledge of a scene or setting before you get into it, which is kind of what leads a researcher there anyway. Another feature of qualitative research are interviews. And again, these are based on ordinary conversations, and they can range from very formalized, structured interviews to more semi-structured interviews, more in-depth interviewing, which obviously we're going to talk about in this one. So this can really provide cross-checks on field observation. So let's say you're at a school and you're doing observations on, interpersonal relationships between preteens, right? It's fun to watch preteens because they're awkward and weird. So you are doing this kind of field research and you see certain things happening. Doing an interview would be a way where you can actually clarify that what you're seeing and the meanings you're attaching to the particular thing that you're seeing. Like, let's say you're witnessing bullying happening. And to find understandings or meanings of that, you can actually then question the people and verify it. Actually, one of the podcasts, hopefully you are listening to the podcast, that goes along with the Give Methods a Chance book really went into that, right? It was actually kind of early on that I assigned that one. That, this woman was doing research in a school setting, trying to understand the way that masculinity operates. And she talked about how a lot of the young people were using homophobic language in order to police the confines of gender, such as calling someone a fag. And as a result, she asked them after, like, does this mean that you are, homophobic? Does this mean whatever? And she found that the meaning attached to the word itself was not what she would have interpreted as an outsider. But by doing the interview, she found that actually, no, they didn't attach the word to sexuality. They attached it to behavioral aspects of maintaining a gender boundary between men and women. So again, the interviews can often cross-check what you're seeing in the observations. And of course, in-depth interviews are often just used as a standalone method because they give you a lot of information. Some other general features. Sometimes you can use supplemental, archival, or other data. So, documentary evidence and stats can be used to contextualize a study. So the government collects a whole bunch of data, typically displayed in statistical form or in data sets that a researcher can use for their own research. And there's also other records that may enhance observation and interviews. So like in the first research example in the chapter, they used records in the form of larger stats, but they also used photos and videos and other materials that really helped verify the experience of the respondents. Another feature is non-probability sampling, just meaning you're not picking random people or random sites, right? It's non-random selection of observation of your field site of the people, which makes sense because the goal is not to generalize it to a large group, but to contribute to existing theory and data and really find things out about a particular issue or a particular group. So this means sometimes the people you're trying to pick have been snowballed from other respondents, that you're trying to find people that fit the scope of your research, right? Another one is the qualitative data analysis itself. So data generally consists of written text in the form of field notes or interview transcriptions, which we'll get to how that works in a second. And the analysis occurs throughout the process of data collection. So this just means that we start seeing some of the patterns emerge as you're writing up your field notes, or sometimes even when you're still in the field. But you need so much data in order to infer things that you can't sit at a place like twice and think that you understand all of its inner workings. So, maybe things are different on different days or different times of the day. Like if you're at the Cal State Fullerton Quad, and who you see, how they use the space, these things may differ on different days or even different times of day, as there's different kinds of students who tend to take morning classes than those who tend to take evening courses. So, you tend to start seeing patterns emerge, but unless you spend a lot of time in a field site, you can't necessarily infer relationships. It takes sometimes years of being in fields. Like I think the minimum for an ethnographic research is about 2 years to get enough data. So the first research example in the book, they talked about that one from 1991 to 2005. That's a lot of years, right? That's a fair amount of years to be doing this kind of research. So as a result, you have your field notes you're writing up, but you also have the transcriptions. Like if you interview people, you're recording it, you got to type up all that crap. So we'll talk about that in a minute too. Also reflexivity, the most important part, I'd say, that researchers have to reflect on how their characteristics and presence can shape the research process. So this involves reflection on the impact of your insider and outsider status in the field setting. Super, super duper important. So you've been on the inside. Now you have to step back a little so that you can see the scope of what you're looking at, right? So we'll talk about that a little more in depth. All right, variations in participation and observation. So field research may vary in participation and observation in the field setting. Some people work as participant observation or participant observers, which is where the researcher participates in some way, right? You're a participant observer. So you're still observing the setting, but you're part of it as well. So participation provides an insider view of reality, right? And of course, you have to balance your participation and observation, which can be challenging. Like, where's the line between your participation in that setting and your role as the researcher or observer? So like my own terrible example of this would be in grad school when we had to do qualitative research field notes, setting stuff. I picked my social location as this dive bar in a dive bowling alley that has a particularly fantastic karaoke nights, which is literally every night. But anyway, being a participant observer meant I had to get my ass up and sing once in a while. Because otherwise, if you're just some creep that sits there all the time and watches other people sing, that can be kind of weird and off-putting for some people. So depending on the kind of setting that you're in, sometimes it makes sense to be a participant, and other times it makes more sense to be a non-participant, just to observe, right? Meaning the researcher doesn't participate. You're like an eavesdropper or a fly on the wall, right? Someone who blends into the scene. So how you determine this participation is usually a matter of degree, right? So this is going to vary across different settings and situations. So how involved you should be really depends on what is your setting and what is the scope of what you're trying to find in your research. So there's different kinds of observation as well. Observation can vary, whether the researcher reveals his or her identity as a researcher, right? So overt observation is when the researcher identifies himself or herself as a researcher to those being observed. So the problem with being overt is that it's like the Hawthorne effect, right? That when you reveal you're researching people, that can cause participants to change their behavior, right? They might be on a better, different behavior around you. But if you're an overt observer, say that 10 times fast, then you're able to typically establish trust and rapport with the people that you're trying to research. So this is very important. Like an example of that could be, there's a book I use in my criminology course called Code of the Street by Elijah Anderson. And in his ethnography, he spent like a fair amount of time living in a impoverished neighborhood and talking to people, being very open about like, I'm doing research, this is what I'm doing. But by being honest and open from the get-go, he's able to kind of facilitate trust with certain gatekeepers in the community that then give him access or information. After a while, you develop almost like friendships or, rapport with people so that they let their guard down. They want to actually talk to you, right? Some people do covert observations. This is where the researcher conceals his or her identity as a researcher. And this, of course, overcomes that problem of reactivity where you fear that your presence is going to change how people act. But it's also something where you might be invading someone's privacy in many settings. Like it's ethically, is like the word I would use, right? Ethically, to kind of really, you could be invading someone's privacy. Like if you're just going to a restaurant and posting up and writing down bits of people's conversations all the time, that's definitely not, when people go into a restaurant, they're not thinking, oh, this is a place where people are going to be recording my interactions or conversations. That really goes against their privacy. So again, like participation, overtness can be a matter of degree. And again, what's right or wrong is really going to be specific to your research or what your aim is that you're trying to research. So this is just a visual representation of the levels of participation and overtness for some of the studies that were mentioned in the chapter as examples. So you can kind of compare their type of research to their level of participation and overtness, because I know that's what you do in your spare time. Okay, so variations in interviews. Interviews may be more or less structured. So semi-structured interviews contain a list of topics with specific open-ended questions. And there's also what are considered very structured interviews where you have a specific set of questions you don't deviate from and you don't ask probing questions, versus an unstructured interview, you just have like a broad topic or themes that you're trying to go through. So the less structure it gets, the more it's like a conversation. So again, it just depends on what's most appropriate for you. Like if you're trying to do in-depth interviews, oftentimes a semi-structured approach is kind of the best because you have, and we'll go through this more in depth in a minute, but you have a kind of a set structure of questions. You can ask probing questions like, oh, like those things you see in a survey where it says, if so, how, or things like that. Like, if you answered yes to this, explain how. Where you can kind of probe a person when they say something. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, does it mean this? To make sure that you're interpreting what they're saying correctly. Or really to kind of let people go off on their tangents, which can often give you some really helpful information. And like I said, the less structured it is, the more it's like a conversation. So interviews can be conducted individually or in groups. So obviously the traditional design is to interview people individually. You kind of have a one-on-one, face-to-face, which helps people kind of put their guard down and develop rapport. But there's also what are called focus group interviews, right? Where you collect data in groups with the researcher serving as a moderator of group discussion. So maybe you've been in one of these or you've seen them portrayed on TV, which typically portrays them in a business or entertainment aspect, but they can be used to examine sociological questions. So focus groups can bring interesting information as people tend to bounce ideas off of each other. It's a lot more dynamic than the one-on-one interview, but the methodology is like super reactive, meaning that they for sure know that they're the subjects of research, which of course is a clear limitation of that approach. All right, so process of conducting field research. We're going to go through each of these individually. So the first step is to select a setting or group of people to study or observe. Then you have to gain access to that sample or group of people, which we'll talk about in a second. But on a basic level, you get access to the location you want to study in or to the group you want to examine. You need to establish roles and relationships. So how do you relate to the people in the field? Decide what you're going to observe, whom you're going to interview, depending on the scope of your research questions. Then you gather the data, you observe or get those interviews done, and you move to analysis and try and interpret your findings. So at this point, you leave the field so that you can write up your report and give yourself a little distance so that you can see a different perspective from your time in the field. So again, we're going to go through each of these in depth in a second here. Okay, so first, selecting settings and gaining access. So there's different kinds of settings, right? First, you have public settings, like a park, a street corner, places that are open to everyone. So these do not require formal permission, but you may need to inform relevant authorities, or what we call gatekeepers. These are the people who need to give you permission to do your research or permission to be in the space. But this does not mean that you're going to have access to participants, as gatekeepers may refer to actual institutions, like a prison, for example. If you got permission from the warden to interview prisoners, that doesn't mean that every prisoner or any prisoner is going to want to talk to you. So the gatekeeper gives you access to the location or the group of people you want to access, but not necessarily the actual participants of your research, right? There's also semi-public settings, such as stores, theaters, restaurants. These usually demand that a person does something, meaning it may arouse suspicion, right? You don't want to creep people out. So that's kind of a key to the whole thing, to be in a setting naturally. So you should inform the owner or manager if you're planning on conducting research regularly at a setting, or those who work in the spaces, in order to gain access, build rapport, gain trust, that kind of stuff. And the last one is private settings, or like someone's home or a private club, that deny access to anyone except members and invited guests. So these always require formal permission. I mean, you can't just walk into someone's house and be like, I'm going to study you in your natural environment, pretend like I'm not here. That's not going to work or be cool, right? Plus, it's illegal. So in some research settings, because of the privacy of it, you need to get formal permission. Like if you were studying like the Freemasons or something, you're not just going to show up at the lodge, right, and expect that you're going to get access. So these, of course, are the most challenging to access. And there's also the part where who you are affects how people see you and relate to you in society. So it's also going to affect the research. So your gender, your age, your sexuality, disability status, race, ethnicity, social class, etc. I could go on for 1,000 years. All of those things are going to affect the research itself. And if you're aware of this, you can mitigate those problems, right? But who you are is also going to affect how you gain access. The next step is establishing roles and relationships. So participation requires working out how the researcher will relate to other people in the field. So if you go to the participant observation route, you need to find the balance between the role of the researcher and the role of participant. The researcher needs to work out their relationship to others in the setting so that they can form relationships with respondents, which is the real goal, right? It's to gain rapport or a kind of friendship with these respondents so that they feel comfortable to talk to you, let their guard down, and be themselves, which is super important to getting good data. You can then find out some really relevant information from people when they're kind of letting their guard down, telling you the truth. Also, researchers may take on formal or informal roles. So, for example, Smith, in the research at the beginning of the chapter, became an unofficial historian, right? So let's say you join a group of people that you want to research in order to understand them more. You could have a formal role in that organization. So the book example is if you wanted to study a nonprofit organization, so you volunteer for it, you now have a formal role in that group as volunteer, right? And this can be good because it makes it easier for those people to relate to you, makes it easier for you to relate to them, because you're getting a perspective of where they're coming from. So generally, the more immersed one becomes in the community, the deeper the understanding that they can develop. So again, if people are comfortable, they're going to talk to you more openly. In general, the more immersed you are, the more you have a membership role in the community, the greater acceptance you're going to have from other people, the more likely the opportunity at the info or personal or intimate information is going to be related to you. And these things definitely enhance your findings. So just think, you wouldn't tell some random stranger your feelings about personal topics, but if you feel a connection and that this person is similar to you and understands in some part where you're coming from, you'll be much more likely to open up and be intimate in your responses, right? So that's what researchers are doing. All right, then you have to decide what and whom to observe. So again, this is determined largely by your research question. The research questions you have shape your research because the whole goal of the methods is to answer your questions you've posed. So there are some settings that it can be a lot more challenging than others to get access to. But again, which ones you're going to do and who you're going to observe really has to do with your question, trying to answer it. So more broad and guiding questions imply broad observations. So maybe you do research at one school, but your research question is asking how low-income schools navigate, I don't know, other variables. So that one school becomes a representation for others. Like, for example, the ethnography between good and ghetto is structured kind of like that. They look at one neighborhood school, but the information is supposed to be more broad towards low-income schools and neighborhoods and really towards African-American women in general, right? The kind of expectations that there's two dichotomous groups. You're either good or you're ghetto, which of course is not real, but that's the way that people label and interpret each other. So that's kind of one example where you're looking at a broad question, so you can kind of imply more broad observations from that to other schools, versus more focused questions imply particular people and events. So if you have a narrow focus in your question, you'll have it in your approach as well. So there's only going to be certain people that fit the requirements of your sample or segment of the narrow population that you're studying. Like if you're doing research on like trans people, right? You're not going to interview random people who are actually cisgendered because being trans is kind of key to fitting the parameters of that research. So how focused your question is going to affect who and what you're observing. So field researchers may rely on key informants. So these are just people that are selected on the basis of their knowledge, expertise, or group status. So these are the people from the location or the group being studied that often have insights into the issue because of their experiences, their proximity to it, or because they have status, they're able to get other people to engage with or, interact with the researcher. And these people are very helpful to kind of explaining to the researcher the meanings and understandings of people in that field setting. All right, so then you got to actually gather and analyze this data, right? So field researchers initially record data as field jottings. These are those brief quotes, phrases, and keywords. This is kind of why I make you do this as a weekly research assignment, just to get a basic understanding of how people compile this kind of data, though you only have to do it like barely. So field jottings themselves are then transformed into more complete data in the form of field notes. These are the more detailed written accounts. So this is typically recorded soon after leaving the field. So let's say the field jottings are like you put down a couple keywords or little phrases or things here and there so that later you remember what happened more clearly, right? Obviously you have to be very engaged and aware and try and think and be actively thinking, but at the same time, so that you don't forget stuff, sometimes you can make little notes for yourself, and that's what those field jottings are. But once you get home, or sometimes people do this in their car, like my mentor would do that. He would have very unstructured interviews with his respondents, and then he would basically get in his car to leave, and he would sit there and make these like more intense jotting notes so that he could then later go home and type them up more formally into field notes. So, sometimes it's right after you leave, sometimes it's when you go home before you go to bed. And this can include observations, reflections, and analyses, like little bits and pieces of relevant info that you think may mean something when you compile it all together later on. And it's from these scribblings that researchers develop more concrete data, and from that data that they then analyze and interpret. So field notes may be augmented with analytic memos. So these are analyses that come to mind in recording and reviewing notes. So sometimes it's more than being in the moment. It takes some reflection time to often see connections or patterns that are emerging. So going into the field and then leaving it can give you time to, get some insight into what you're working on. So, sometimes even while you're just working on it, like transcribing an interview, as you're typing out all of the words, you often will hear quotes that you're like, oh, that reminds me of what some other person said. And that's how you start developing different codes, right? Coding is what they call that, where you say, you organize the answers around different themes that keep popping up, like different patterns that keep popping up in your responses or in the transcriptions that you have from those interviews. So, you're coding them as you do it. But of course, once everything's all typed up and done, you're going through this much more in depth to really, think about those codes. So also, there's this importance of leaving the field to write the report. So leaving the field is similar to saying goodbyes in everyday life. This involves considering how the people in the field are going to relate to your absence. So if you're a presence or a participant in a space, this can be bittersweet, as you have to collect all the info you need, and now it's your time to get a little space so you can reflect and apply theory to your research findings. So this often raises a question of reciprocity. People have taken time out to participate in your research. So if you're doing research like a long-term ethnography and you've been following someone for a decade, it's not, the way that you approach this, it'd be pretty sad to be like, thanks, bye, got all I need, nice knowing you. That's really not unfair to those people you've spent like over a decade with. So reciprocity is just giving after getting. So this factors into some research approaches where people attempt to thank their participants in some function for their participation. And then the writing occurs throughout the research process. You're going to be writing field jottings, with which time become field notes, with time become codes and patterns, which then become analysis. And then you connect those patterns to existing theories to try and understand them in an inductive approach. So written reports contain vivid descriptions and verbatim statements. You're trying to let the respondents' words speak for themselves. They are the data. You then have to tell your interpretation of your meanings of those statements, but you include the verbatim wording in order to let the reader of the research see if their interpretation is the same or not of your theoretical understandings of your findings. Like, you let their words speak for them, because that's kind of the whole point of this, is that you're often interviewing people that are marginal, that don't have their voice raised, right? That you're often dispelling stereotypes and misconceptions about groups. So using their words is key. Okay, so switching gears from field research to in-depth interviews. This is similar, obviously, to doing field research. There's some essential steps you have to go through to conduct in-depth interviews. So we're going to go through each one of these in the next few slides, like how you select and recruit people, develop your interview guide, gather it, and analyze it. All right, so selecting and recruiting interviewees. So this selection, obviously, like before, just like with field research, it's based on your research question. So who you pick has everything to do with what your question is asking and what setting or population your question is asking about. Again, it doesn't make sense to ask random people, so you're going to use non-probability sampling. It doesn't make sense to ask random people if they may not have the appropriate knowledge or experiences to answer the questions that you're asking. So for this reason, you need to specifically select people that meet your criteria. Like, for example, when I've done in-depth interviews on voting behaviors or understandings of voting, it wouldn't make sense to interview people that didn't vote, right? So it's kind of a precursor to the research, is that it can't be non-probability sampling. I can't pick any person at random if that person doesn't fit the requirements of what I need. Okay, so recruitment is often a matter of convenience and accessibility. It can be hard to find a lot of people that fit the scope of your interests, especially if you're dealing with a marginalized population, like such as the undocumented, right? It's not like you can just look them up in the phone book. You need to get other people that you talk to refer you to their friends or other contacts that they know. So for example, I have a friend named Anna from grad school that when she was doing research, she was doing it on deviant activities. So she was looking at people that were like professionals in their 40s that were adult marijuana users, like on a daily basis. And she was interviewing them, trying to understand what their meanings or understandings were to mitigate the kind of deviant understanding of that behavior in the culture, right? So how do you live this middle class mainstream life, but then have this deviant activity that you're a part of, right? How do you understand that? That's what she was looking at. So obviously in that case, you can't just pick people randomly. You need to pick people that fit the criteria of professional adults in their 40s to 50s with, some of them with families, some of them with not, that were daily users, right? So to do that, she used a lot of snowballing, meaning that some of the participants she talked to early in her research, she asked them, hey, do you know anyone else that would fit the criteria of the research so that I can also ask them questions? And this is a common feature, especially in interviewing, that you're going to go with a convenience sample, right? The people that you can get access to in a short period of time, right? And so often that accessibility comes through asking other people that have already been part of your research to refer you to other people that might fit the criteria. Okay, then once you've picked your people, you've recruited them, you got to develop an interview guide. So your interview guide contains a list of topics, and for semi-structured interviews, specific questions. Again, this depends on the structure, how this is actually going to look, which I'm going to show you a picture of in a minute. Anyway, so you could have a very structured interview. So the interview guide for a very structured interview is going to have like all the same questions for every single person, no probing questions, top to bottom, you have to ask the same stuff. Semi-structured is going to have like a list of questions, but you're also going to probe. So you might have some potential probing questions as well that are part of it. But then, for something that's unstructured, you're typically just going to have a topic or a theme to talk about, just to kind of give a general sense of where the conversation should lead. So this includes your main questions and your probing questions. Your main questions are directly related to the research question, but the probes are typically follow-ups that clarify the responses and gather additional information. So if someone says like, yes, I do believe that blah, 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 and you could probe to say, okay, well, why is that? Can you explain to me your experience of this, or that? That way you know that you're accurately interpreting what they're saying, and you're not just assuming it based on limited information. So probing questions can be very helpful in just making sure that you're actually seeing what you think you're seeing. So this also features open-ended questions, which may include a grand tour question. So, just like a general description of the people, processes, or events being studied. Like if I'm looking at voting behaviors, like, what do you think about the importance of voting, or something like that? Just a kind of generalizing question that's an overarching question in regards to everything you're looking at, so that people can kind of like rant at it a little bit. And open-ended just means there's no set answers. It's not a yes or no question. You give them the opportunity to answer however they feel, and that's going to give you some interesting information oftentimes that can kind of clarify things that you might not understand. Okay, so this is an interview guide from your book, just giving you a kind of sense of the breakdown of how this works. So you can see that the questions are subcategorized into different topics, or at least in this case, different variables that you're looking at. So, racial labels and identity, experiences of race, marriage, all these kind of different subheadings, which really kind of helps you not just organize the conversation more logically, but also when you're writing up your findings, like your paper's flow kind of becomes this, because you've already separated the questions into these kind of chunks. And again, part of a great survey instrument or interview guide or any of these things is really figuring out how to ask the questions in the right order. That means that people are giving you good information without being really kind of guarded about it. Okay, so when it comes to gathering and analyzing data, interviews should begin with an explanation of the study and the acquisition of informed consent. So first off, you have to be like, you have informed consent. Here's an informed consent document. They literally have to sign the document before you can start anything. You explain to them what the research is about, what their part of the research is. What I do, because I take a feminist methodological approach, I actually offer people the opportunity to look at what I write about them eventually, like once I've drafted it all up, so that if they feel like they're being mischaracterized or represented unfairly, that they have the opportunity to oversee that. And so far, so good. No one's felt that they have been misinterpreted, because clearly I already know what I think about stuff. The whole point of research is, what do these people think? What does this group think? What is happening in this particular location? It's pretty self-serving to just be like, no, I figured it out. I don't need to ask these people. So, obviously you need to be very clear about the scope of things. You need to have informed consent and explain that part of informed consent is that they know if there's any risks or potential harm that can come to them, how their information is going to be stored, right? Those things are important. Is it going to be confidential? That kind of stuff. Can't be anonymous because you've seen their face, right? If you interview someone, you can't necessarily say they're anonymous, but you can definitely make them confidential by like changing their name in the write-up or something of that nature, protecting their identity. And again, part of informed consent is that they can leave at any point. If they're like, I don't feel like being part of this anymore, then that's their right. So again, with with the informed consent, questions have to be asked in certain orders. And again, interviews are going to be unique, right? Each one is going to be different. Even if you're asking the same questions, each interview is its own monster. So interviews usually are recorded and supplemented with field jottings and notes. I try to limit my note taking during interviews because people get weird about it. Just as I'm assuming it's like that thing with like therapists or something, like they start writing something down and people are like, well, what are they writing down? Right? Oftentimes as a researcher, when you're doing the interview, there's like a certain thing they say or do that you want to like kind of understand the importance of, or you see that as an important topic. So you kind of write a little note to yourself to remind yourself, okay, when they said this, look for that. But then again, remember that could kind of put people off and you don't want to do that. So sometimes these are, I mean, when you say recorded, they're typically audio recordings, right? Some people do video recordings, but again, that makes people more uncomfortable and you want them to be comfortable so that they just talk as they normally would. So the transcriptions you make, which is the nightmare, can be analyzed with qualitative analysis software. Oh, geez. So transcription's probably the worst part. You interview someone. An average interview that would take, like, let's say an hour is going to, on average, take about 7 hours to transcribe it, which is nightmarish. So, like, I use this thing called Dragon software for my transcription, as transcription takes forever. So when using that software, it's like a voice recognition kind of thing where I can speak into it. Using that software, I was able to basically get my transcription time down to maybe like 3 hours for a 1 hour interview, which is still long, but it's a hell of a lot better than 7, right? You're shaving off 4 hours for each interview. And if you're doing a lot of interviews, that's a lot of time. So, though I know that like some people literally outsource this stuff, which I would never encourage someone to do that. I know someone that did that in my, like when I was in grad school, and I was like, wow, that you're defeating the entire purpose of doing a thesis. Because sometimes when you're transcribing, even though it's, again, a nightmarish process, you have to hear your own voice like 100,000 times and you want to die. But at the same time, as you're doing it, you start noticing stuff. You start noticing patterns, themes, stuff that starts coming up over and over. So I think it's actually a helpful thing, even though it's, you know, time consuming and kind of awful, because slowly as you're doing it, you start to kind of notice those things before you get to the full analysis part. So the analysis results in rich description and theoretical conclusions, because you're basically going to find certain quotes or, you know, certain standalone things, and then you're going to analyze them based on existing data or theories, right? So in that kind of inductive approach, you have this information. Now, how do you get a theory to interpret it, right? So, you know, someone has this particular finding, and because of their demographic background or because of whatever their perspective, you can then infer certain things or connect them to existing theories to help understand how they work, right? And that's really how you're building theory or contributing to the existing theories, which is an important part of qualitative research. So some of the strengths of qualitative research, the first is the naturalistic approach. So in field research, you don't have to ask someone in a survey what they do or how they act. You just watch them, right? There's no BSing you in that kind of way, especially if you're in a very covert observation where people don't even realize that you're watching them, right? They're much more likely to act as themselves, and that can give you some really interesting information without the bias of not just people lying, but the idea that sometimes people have a better or nicer view of themselves than reality. And so they'll be like, no, I would only act like this or that, though in reality they would act very differently. So it is a naturalistic approach. You get to kind of see how people are actually acting in natural settings, and really in-depth interviews, you know, if that's the strength of the field research part of it, but in-depth interviews also allow people to answer questions in their own words. And especially if you're doing a semi-structured or unstructured approach, you're able to really kind of get at, well, why do you say that? Well, what do you mean? Can you give me an example? To really clarify why someone's saying what they're saying or what they're saying, so that you're not misinterpreting them or, you know, misreporting the findings or kind of attaching your own understanding to what they're saying. You can literally be like, well, what do you mean by that? So that it's not, oh, well, I think they mean this. It's literally what they say is what it means. And that's a very helpful thing in research. When you're talking about people, we can often interpret them in various ways that come through our own biases and understandings. So Ask them. Ask them directly. Well, what do you mean by that? Give me an example. And from that, you're often going to find a much better, clearer understanding. There's also these subjectual or I just put the two words together, subjective and contextual understanding. So basically, you're gaining an insider view of how people's worlds work, right? This can be in the field part of it from being either participating in the setting by being a participant observer, or really just the firsthand knowledge that you get from watching people and how they interact and what they do. This really gives you that insider view. And again, you're studying people in their own social environment, so you're seeing how they interact within that specific context, which can be often different from how they interact in different contexts, like how you interact with your friends is different from your family or your coworkers or things like that. So the specific social environment is important, and this is kind of that strength over when we talked about research done in laboratory settings has a more of a strength of saying, this variable causes a change in this other variable, like having your independent and dependent variable connections. But at the same time, you don't know if those things would actually happen in the real world outside of a lab. Through this subjective and contextual understanding, you do know that it is happening in the real world. And again, there's a very flexible research design. There's not like a super cookie cutter approach to this. This is something that you can adapt to a lot of different research aims. It lends itself to studies of dynamic situations, right? This could be small groups. This could be literally like a university setting. This could be all sorts of things. And as a result, that's pretty flexible. It gives people a lot of latitude to study various different things. And also the research can be altered as the data is gathered. So that's a helpful thing too. Like I've had that happen in my own interviewing experience where you ask certain questions and then you start getting people you ask a probing question to one person and they really give you some interesting information. And then you think, okay, the next people I'm going to ask them that question to. Or another good feature of it is if you're interviewing people, you often have an opportunity to kind of like meet up with them again after the first interview, just to kind of, if you need to clarify anything or, sometimes that's the opportunity to ask them those probing questions. Like, so when you said this, did you mean this or what did you mean by that? Which again means that sometimes you can find stuff. See, this is what's really interesting about qualitative research is in quantitative, you're setting out a pretty specific relationship. Like I want to see if variable A affects variable B. But in qualitative research, you're not looking at it in that straightforward approach. You're pretty much gathering the data and then inferring in stuff based on theory after the fact. So this means that you can kind of change it as you're going. So, one of my mentors, Dana, I guess I should say Professor Collins, if you've had her, she was doing research on basically people that were expatriates of the U.S., and how in the Philippines they were providing almost like sex tourism. Like she was looking at people that were providing through what she considered sex work, these kind of like tour guide services that involved sexual relationships. And so she conceptualized the whole thing as sex work, went over there, started interviewing people, and found out that the participants themselves did not see themselves as sex workers. They saw themselves as like, I don't know, tour guides with a bonus, right? And as a result, she said, oh, okay, well, the existing theories I already looked at for this don't apply anymore because this isn't considered sex work in the same way. So she had to then alter it as she was going. But instead of having to scrap the whole research, she could then just change her questions a little bit and be like, oh, okay, well then how do you see your relationship, right? And she found a lot of really interesting stuff out of that. Though there were, of course, a couple people that did consider it sex work. That's what they were doing. But it was really interesting to see how the participants' meanings are what are going to lead your research, not what your assumptions were before you walked into that field setting. It's what happens in that setting. It's what happens in those interviews that really help you understand it. And that's like a huge hallmark to the strength of qualitative research. Just as any other type of research, it has weaknesses. The first is generalizability, meaning you can't generalize your results to a specific population. So you can't say, oh, I interviewed these 15 people, therefore all people that fit this criteria, therefore whatever, right? But you can provide theoretical generalizations. So kind of like the example I gave you before, like the ethnography between good and ghetto, right? Like she basically provided some theoretical generalizations about the experiences of young African American girls in impoverished neighborhoods, right? Or how they deal with the school system or how they're interpreted by the school system. Those things, you're providing generalizations based on that topic, but you're not able to say like, oh, 20% of these people experience this and therefore, that applies to everybody, like every young African American girl or something like that. You can't generalize it to the larger population. To do that, remember, you're going to need probability sampling, which means random sampling. And this is not random sampling. We're not doing random sampling in qualitative. Why? Because you need people that actually fit the scope of what you're looking for. If you pick people at random, they might not have the knowledge or experience to lend to what you're talking about, right? So you can't generalize. Well, not really. You can theoretically, but not really. Okay, the next is reliability and validity. So the quality of data and analysis are dependent on the skills of the researcher. This is important too. You can mess up some stuff by not listening enough to your participants, by not interpreting these things well. And this is where, again, that feminist methodology or praxis approach that I believe in really helps, because you just ask the people, just keep asking them, is this what you meant by this? Right? And again, that idea that the researcher themselves, who they are, is going to affect the research means that your identity, your gender, your sexuality, all these kind of things, they're going to affect the way that people understand and interpret you. So again, you can improve your reliability and validity by knowing that, right? By knowing that, having, that reflexivity to say like, well, this is how people might interpret me because I'm female. Or this is how people might interpret me because I'm white, or, whatever, any of those kind of things. And that can really help you kind of mitigate stuff. But think about it, just like in normal human life, if you're not very reflective, you're not usually a good judge of who you are, right? And that's kind of what it takes to be a good researcher in this way, is you have to be very reflective of your research and kind of take your ego out of it and think about, okay, well, in what potential ways have I messed this up or caused bias or, affected the results? And in what ways can I protect against that by understanding who I am and how to mitigate those things? Efficiency is the biggest weakness of qualitative research by far, especially if you're talking like ethnography. It takes like a ridiculous amount of time. Like, think about it. The first research study they talked about in the chapter, from 1991 to 2005. Yeah, I mean, that sounds great to get like a lot of research, but who's paying you? Right? Like, how much money did you get from this research grant that you're able to financially support yourself for X many years? Right? It's really expensive to do this research. If it's going to take like a long ass time, it's not necessarily super expensive just from what you're doing. Like, you're just like writing down questions and asking people. I mean, you got to have like a recorder or computer to type up some crap or whatever it is. But it's just the amount of time it takes to do this. Like, if I'm going to interview, 20 people, that could be 20 hours of time it takes to do that. That could take a couple weeks. But then when it comes to actually transcribing all that crap, if it takes 7 hours for every hour, right, then you can just keep exponentially adding time to these things. So it takes a lot of time, and then you have to analyze the stuff and, develop theory or connections to existing theories to understand this stuff. So it can just be the fact that a survey, you basically you make it, you give it out, you get results immediately. That's a lot more efficient than something where you really have to go through this kind of give and take process, though you can find out some really interesting information through qualitative research.